Martha Collins had always felt an unexplainable bond with the mountains. Her earliest memories were of running barefoot through the dense forests that surrounded her grandfather's secluded cabin, her small hands tracing the rough bark of trees that had stood for centuries. The cabin, a sturdy wooden structure built in the 1930s, had been her sanctuary during childhood summers. It was where she learned to read by the dim light of an oil lamp, where she listened to her grandfather's stories about the land, and where she first fell in love with the natural world. Her grandfather, Harold Collins, was a quiet man, but one who spoke passionately about the importance of preserving nature. The land remembers, he used to say, tapping his cane on the cabin's porch. It knows who cares for it and who takes it for granted. When Harold passed away, he left the property to Martha in his will, bypassing other family members, a decision that had caused some bitterness among her cousins, Eric and Jenny. Harold had always been close to Martha, who shared his love of the land and his understanding of its value beyond money. For her, the cabin and the surrounding forest weren't just a piece of real estate, they were a legacy. Years later, after completing her studies in environmental biology and enduring a painful divorce, Martha returned to the cabin. It was her refuge, the one place where she felt whole. Though the property had fallen into disrepair during her years away, she resolved to restore it, both as a way to honor her grandfather's memory and to continue her environmental research. The work was slow but fulfilling. Martha spent her mornings repairing the cabin, sanding down the weathered wood and patching up the roof. Afternoons were dedicated to her research on local flora, specifically a rare type of pine tree found only in this region. Her evenings were spent reading by the fireplace, her dog Toby, a spry border collie, curled up at her feet. The isolation didn't bother her, if anything, it felt like a gift. She had grown weary of the noise and demands of city life. Here, in the mountains, the silence was her companion, and the only interruptions were the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. Her peace was shattered one bright summer morning. Martha was tending to her vegetable garden when she heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Turning toward the sound, she saw a black SUV pulling up the winding driveway. The vehicle came to a halt, and two figures emerged, her cousins, Eric and Jenny. Eric, with his ever-present air of smug entitlement, was dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and jeans that looked brand new. Jenny, his younger sister, wore oversized sunglasses and clutched a designer handbag. They didn't belong here, not in this rugged, unpolished landscape. Martha wiped her hands on her jeans and walked toward them, her heart sinking. She hadn't seen them in years, not since her grandfather's funeral, and their sudden appearance was anything but a friendly visit. Eric smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Martha," he said, spreading his arms as if welcoming her to her own home. "It's been too long." Jenny was less subtle. "You've really let the place go," she said, her tone dripping with disdain as she looked around at the cabin and the overgrown yard. Martha ignored the comment, focusing on Eric. "What are you doing here?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Eric feigned surprise. "Is that any way to greet family? We came to talk about the property. It's about time we had a discussion, don't you think?" Martha's stomach tightened. She had anticipated this moment ever since the will had been read, but she had hoped it wouldn't come to this. "There's nothing to discuss," she said firmly. "Grandpa left the cabin to me. It's not up for debate." Eric's smile faded, and a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "Come on, Martha. You can't seriously think you can handle this place on your own. Look at it. It's falling apart." Jenny chimed in, her voice sharp. "You're wasting it. Do you know what this land is worth? Developers would pay a fortune for it. We could all benefit." Martha felt a surge of anger but kept her composure. "This land isn't for sale," she said. "It wasn't for sale when Grandpa was alive, and it's not for sale now." Eric took a step closer, his tone shifting from condescending to menacing. "You don't understand what you're sitting on. This land isn't just valuable, it's prime real estate, and if you think you can hold on to it forever, you're mistaken." Martha met his gaze, refusing to back down. "I'm not selling, and if that's why you're here, you can leave." For a moment there was silence, the kind that feels heavy and full of unspoken threats. Then Eric's lips curled into a smirk. "Fine," he said, stepping back. "But don't say we didn't warn you." He turned and walked back to the SUV, Jenny trailing behind him. As the vehicle disappeared down the driveway, Martha stood rooted to the spot, her hands trembling. She knew this wasn't the end of it. That evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Martha felt the weight of her grandfather's legacy pressing down on her. She had fought hard to rebuild her life, and she wasn't about to let anyone take this from her. Whatever came next, she would be ready. The first signs of trouble began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like faint whispers carried on the mountain breeze. Martha first noticed it a few days after her cousin's unwelcome visit. She had spent the morning repairing a section of the fence that bordered the eastern side of her property when she spotted something unusual on the far edge of the woods. A few trees had been cut down, their stumps fresh, with sawdust still scattered across the ground. The sight struck her as odd because this part of the forest had always been untouched. Even her grandfather had been adamant about leaving these trees alone, referring to them as the ancient guardians of the land. At first she thought it might have been the work of someone from the forestry department, or perhaps a mistake by a misguided logger. Wanting to confirm her suspicions, she contacted the local ranger station. The officer she spoke to assured her that no permits had been issued for logging in the area. "Are you sure it's not someone on your land?" he asked. "We've had issues lately with road crews cutting down trees illegally." Martha felt her unease deepen. If someone was trespassing on her property, it wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate act. That evening she walked the perimeter of her land with Toby by her side. The air was cool, the sky painted in shades of amber and violet as the sun set behind the mountains. As she examined the tree line, she noticed more signs of intrusion: deep tire tracks in the dirt, trampled vegetation, and even a few discarded energy drink cans. Whoever had been here wasn't trying very hard to cover their tracks. She took pictures with her phone and made a mental note to report it to the authorities. The following day brought an even greater shock. Martha had just finished breakfast when she decided to retrieve some tools from the old shed behind the cabin. As she approached the door, she noticed the faint scent of smoke lingering in the air. Pushing the door open, her stomach dropped. Inside, several of her research tools, her field notebooks, a portable spectrometer, and even her laptop were charred beyond recognition. Someone had broken in and set fire to the shed. The tools and data she had spent months collecting were now reduced to ashes. Her first reaction was disbelief. Who would do such a thing? Why would anyone target her work? Her thoughts immediately turned to Eric and Jenny. Could they be behind this? The memory of Eric's smug warning echoed in her mind. "Don't say we didn't warn you," but surely even they wouldn't stoop this low. Her hands trembled as she called the local police, explaining the situation and requesting someone come to investigate. When the officers arrived later that afternoon, Martha showed them the burned tools and the evidence of the logging she had discovered in the woods. The two officers, a young man and an older woman, examined the shed and jotted down notes, but their expressions revealed little urgency. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" the older officer asked. Martha hesitated. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the connection felt too obvious to ignore. "I think it might be my cousins," she said carefully. "They were here a few days ago, and they've been pressuring me to sell this property. When I refused, they weren't happy." The officer nodded, scribbling in her notepad. "Do you have any proof they were involved in this incident?" "No," Martha admitted, frustration creeping into her voice. "But they're the only ones who have a motive. They want this land and they'll do anything to get it." The younger officer stepped forward. "We'll file a report, but without concrete evidence, there's not much we can do right now. You might want to consider installing some security cameras or motion detectors to keep an eye on the property." Martha bit back a sharp response. Cameras wouldn't bring back her destroyed research, and they certainly wouldn't hold anyone accountable. As the officers left, promising to follow up, she felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. The people who were supposed to protect her seemed indifferent, and she was left to fend for herself. Later that evening, Martha sat on her porch, staring at the stars. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth, but she found no comfort in it. The shed fire had rattled her more than she cared to admit. This wasn't just about the property anymore, this was personal. Someone had violated her space, her sanctuary, and it felt like an unspoken challenge. She couldn't let them win. Determined to take action, she decided to follow the officer's advice and invest in some security measures. The next day, she drove into town and purchased several motion-activated cameras, which she installed around the cabin and the shed. She also reinforced the locks on her doors and windows, making it clear that she wouldn't be caught off guard again. But the intrusions didn't stop. 2 nights later, Martha was awoken by a strange noise outside her bedroom window, a soft rustling, followed by the sound of footsteps. Heart pounding, she grabbed the flashlight she kept by her bed and crept toward the window. Peering out into the darkness, she couldn't see anyone, but Toby was growling low in his throat, his ears pinned back. The next morning, she found fresh footprints in the dirt outside her window. Then came the threatening notes. The first was left on her porch, a single sheet of paper scrawled with the words, "Sell or else." A second note, tucked under her windshield wiper, was more explicit: "You're alone up here. Be smart and walk away." Martha's anger flared. She wasn't the type to be intimidated, but the growing sense of isolation was impossible to ignore. If someone wanted her gone, they were willing to escalate until they got what they wanted. The final straw came when she returned from a trip into town to find the remains of a deer carcass dumped on her driveway. Its blood had soaked into the gravel, leaving a macabre scene that made her stomach churn. The message was clear: whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare her, they wanted her to feel unsafe in her own home. Martha knew she couldn't handle this alone. She called her lawyer, a pragmatic woman named Evelyn Sharp, and explained the escalating situation. Evelyn listened carefully, her voice steady as she offered advice. "If your cousins are behind this, they're playing a dangerous game. You have every right to protect your property. I'll start gathering documentation to strengthen your case, but you need to be vigilant. Don't let them push you into a corner." Evelyn's words gave Martha a sense of purpose. She wasn't going to be driven off her land by fear or intimidation. Her grandfather had trusted her with this property, and she wouldn't let his legacy be stolen by greed. That night, as she reviewed the footage from her newly installed cameras, she caught a shadowy figure near the edge of the forest. Though the image was grainy, the figure's posture was unmistakable. It was Eric. The sight of him reignited her resolve. If Eric thought he could bully her into submission, he was in for a rude awakening. She didn't know what his next move would be, but one thing was certain: she wasn't backing down. Martha woke early the next morning, the events of the past week heavy on her mind. The burned shed, the threatening notes, and now the unmistakable image of Eric captured by her cameras all pointed to one conclusion: her cousins were willing to escalate this conflict as far as it took to get what they wanted. She made coffee and sat on the porch with Toby at her feet, staring at the surrounding forest as if the trees themselves could offer her some kind of clarity. Instead, all she felt was unease. The peace that had once defined her life here was gone, replaced by an ever-present tension that gnawed at her. Determined not to let Eric and Jenny intimidate her, Martha decided to focus her energy on protecting the land and uncovering their intentions. She started the day by thoroughly inspecting the property, searching for anything unusual. It didn't take long to find more signs of sabotage. On the southern edge of the forest, she discovered several young saplings that had been deliberately hacked down. The cuts were clean and purposeful, made with professional tools. Nearby, the ground was scarred with tire marks, evidence of vehicles that had no business being there. Furious, Martha returned to the cabin and called her lawyer, Evelyn Sharp, to report the latest developments. Evelyn's calm, measured tone was a welcome contrast to Martha's frustration. "This is a clear pattern of harassment," Evelyn said. "We need to document everything. Take photos, keep a log of every incident, no matter how small. I'll start drafting a formal complaint, but we'll need solid evidence to back it up." Evelyn's advice was practical, but it didn't quell Martha's anger. She felt powerless, caught in a game she hadn't chosen to play. It wasn't just her land that was under attack, it was her sense of safety, her connection to the place she loved. As the day wore on, she resolved to take a more active role in defending herself. She installed additional cameras along the property's borders, ensuring there were no blind spots. She also reinforced the locks on her cabin and moved what little remained of her research equipment into a secure storage chest inside. But Eric and Jenny weren't done. That night, Martha was jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass. Heart pounding, she grabbed the flashlight and baseball bat she kept by her bed and crept to the living room. The source of the noise was immediately clear. The front window had been shattered, shards of glass littering the floor. Outside, the darkness seemed impenetrable, but the faint sound of an engine starting in the distance told her whoever had done this was already gone. The next morning, Martha reviewed the camera footage, her stomach twisting with anticipation. The grainy black and white images showed two figures approaching the cabin under the cover of darkness. One of them, taller and broader, was unmistakably Eric. He carried something heavy in his hands, a crowbar, she guessed, and used it to smash the window before retreating into the shadows. The second figure hung back, but Martha was certain it was Jenny. She sent the footage to Evelyn, who assured her it would strengthen their case. "This is exactly the kind of evidence we need," Evelyn said. "If they're bold enough to vandalize your home, they've crossed a legal line. I'll file for a restraining order first thing Monday morning." Though it was a small victory, it brought Martha little comfort. Eric and Jenny's actions weren't just about the land anymore, they were personal. That much became clear later that week, when Martha discovered that the water supply to her cabin had been tampered with. After noticing a strange metallic taste in the tap water, she traced the issue to the well. Someone had dumped debris into it, clogging the system and rendering it unusable. It took hours to clean out the well and restore the flow of water, and the effort left her exhausted and angry. Frustrated by the constant attacks, Martha decided to bring in reinforcements. She reached out to a local security company and hired a guard to patrol the property at night. The guard, a no-nonsense man named Greg, assured her that he'd dealt with similar situations before. "People like your cousins thrive on intimidation," he said. "The moment they realize someone's watching, they usually back off." But Eric and Jenny weren't typical bullies. The very night Greg began his patrols, Martha was woken by the sound of barking. She rushed outside to find Greg shining his flashlight toward the tree line, where the faint glow of headlights was visible through the foliage. "They've been sitting there for over an hour," Greg said, nodding toward the car. "Haven't gotten out, haven't said anything, just watching." Martha's blood ran cold. The car disappeared a few minutes later, but the message was clear: Eric and Jenny weren't afraid of being seen. They wanted her to know they were watching. The next day, Martha decided it was time to confront them. She drove into town and stopped by the small office building where Eric worked as a consultant. Marching past the receptionist, she found him in his office, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin. "Martha," he said, spreading his arms, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "You need to stop," she said, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "The vandalism, the threats, the surveillance, this isn't a game, Eric. You're breaking the law." Eric chuckled, leaning forward. "Breaking the law? Come on, Martha, you're being dramatic. I haven't done anything you can prove, and even if I had, who's going to believe you? You're all alone up there, while Jenny and I have plenty of witnesses who can vouch for us." The audacity of his words left Martha momentarily speechless. He wasn't even trying to hide his involvement, he was flaunting it, confident that she couldn't touch him. "I'm not alone," she said finally. "I have a lawyer. I have security. And I'm not going to let you or anyone else take what's mine." Eric's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "We'll see about that," he said, leaning back in his chair again. "Enjoy your little cabin while you still can." As she left his office, Martha felt a mix of frustration and determination. Eric's arrogance only strengthened her resolve to fight back, but she also knew she needed more help. That evening, she called Evelyn and asked about escalating their case. Evelyn suggested hiring a private investigator to dig into Eric and Jenny's activities. "If they're this brazen, there's a good chance they've left a paper trail," Evelyn said. "The more we uncover, the stronger your case will be." Martha agreed and set the plan into motion. The next few days passed in a tense blur as the investigator began their work. Meanwhile, the security guard Greg continued his patrols, and Martha focused on maintaining her land, despite the constant fear of what Eric and Jenny might do next. She didn't know how far they were willing to go, but one thing was clear: she wasn't going to back down. This land was her grandfather's legacy, and she would protect it at any cost. The tension on the property reached a new peak in the weeks that followed. Martha felt as though she was living in a war zone, constantly bracing for the next attack. She had done everything she could to protect herself, hiring a security guard, installing cameras, filing complaints through her lawyer Evelyn, but Eric and Jenny were relentless. Their efforts to intimidate her had grown bolder, and the sense of dread weighed on her like a storm cloud that refused to clear. It started with an envelope that appeared on her porch one morning, sealed and addressed in neat block letters. Inside was an unsigned letter written in cold, professional language, warning her that continued refusal to negotiate the sale of the property could lead to consequences that would outweigh the cost of cooperation. The wording was vague but unmistakably threatening. It was the kind of calculated language that sent a chill down her spine. Evelyn, when shown the letter, was equally disturbed. "This isn't just a family squabble anymore," she said. "They're escalating this into something far more dangerous. Whoever's advising them or working with them knows exactly what they're doing." Evelyn's words set off alarm bells in Martha's mind. Could it be possible that Eric and Jenny weren't acting alone? The persistence and precision of their attacks suggested more than just petty family greed. That suspicion deepened later that week when Martha noticed a group of workers surveying the edge of her property. From a distance, it looked like they were mapping the land, their bright orange vests and surveyor's equipment catching the sunlight. When Martha approached to confront them, they were evasive. The man in charge claimed they were conducting routine environmental assessments, but he couldn't, or wouldn't, say who had hired them. When she asked for identification or documentation, he simply shrugged and said, "You'll find out soon enough." Then they packed up their equipment and left. That night, Martha called Evelyn again, recounting the encounter. Evelyn's tone was grim. If they're bringing in surveyors, they might be trying to push for a forced sale. There are loopholes in land laws that can sometimes be exploited if a property is deemed critical for development or public use. It's rare but not impossible. The thought of losing her land through some legal trickery was terrifying. Martha decided she needed to take action before things spiraled further out of control. She spent the next day digging through her grandfather's old files, searching for anything that could strengthen her claim to the property. In a dusty box tucked away in the cabin's attic, she found a set of documents that caught her attention: original land deeds and hand-drawn maps dating back to when Harold first purchased the land. One map, in particular, stood out. It detailed the property's boundaries and marked several locations with cryptic notations in Harold's handwriting. Words like spring deposit and protected zone were scrawled next to small excess scattered across the map. Intrigued, Martha decided to investigate these marked locations the next morning. With Toby trotting alongside her, she ventured deep into the forest, using the map as her guide. The first few locations were unremarkable, just clearings or patches of dense undergrowth. But at the third site, she found something that stopped her in her tracks: an old, rusted sign partially buried beneath moss and leaves. The faded text read, "No trespassing, protected watershed area." Nearby, a small trickle of water emerged from the ground, feeding into a shallow stream that wound its way through the trees. Martha's mind raced. If this part of the property was officially recognized as a protected area, it could be a crucial piece of evidence in her fight against Eric and Jenny. She took photos of the sign and the surrounding area before marking the spot on her map and heading back to the cabin. Her excitement was short-lived. That evening, as she reviewed the footage from her security cameras, she noticed something disturbing. A group of men, all wearing dark clothing, had been spotted on the edge of her property around 3 a.m. They weren't carrying tools or machinery this time. Instead, they seemed to be scouting, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they moved methodically through the forest. It was clear they weren't there by accident. The sight of them sent a surge of fear through Martha, but it also hardened her resolve. Whoever these men were, they were playing a dangerous game. She forwarded the footage to Evelyn and Greg, her security guard, both of whom shared her concerns. "They're getting more desperate," Greg said. But that also makes them sloppy. We're bound to catch them in the act if they keep this up. The next day brought an unexpected twist. Martha received a formal notice in the mail, stamped with the seal of a local development company. The letter claimed that the company had submitted a proposal to build a new luxury resort in the area and that her property was a key component of the project. They offered her a significant sum of money to sell the land, promising that the development would bring progress and prosperity to the region. The letter also included thinly veiled threats about legal action if she refused to cooperate. Evelyn's reaction to the letter was immediate. "This is it," she said. "This is the end game. Eric and Jenny must be working with these developers. They want your land, and they're willing to use every tactic, legal and otherwise, to force you out. We need to fight this on multiple fronts." Over the next few days, Evelyn filed motions to block any attempts at a forced sale, while Martha focused on rallying support from local conservation groups. She reached out to contacts she had made during her time as an environmental biologist, hoping they could help her highlight the ecological importance of her land. One group, in particular, expressed interest in the watershed area she had discovered, citing its potential as a vital natural resource. Their involvement gave Martha a glimmer of hope. If she could prove the land's environmental value, it would make it much harder for the developers or her cousins to take it away. But Eric and Jenny weren't giving up without a fight. One afternoon, Martha returned home from a meeting with the conservation group to find her property vandalized. The cameras had been smashed, the front porch spray painted with crude insults, and several trees near the cabin had been cut down and left to rot. It was a brazen act of defiance, and it left no doubt in Martha's mind that her cousins were behind it. She called Greg, who arrived within the hour, his jaw tightening as he surveyed the damage. "This is getting out of hand," he said. "We need to catch them red-handed, or they're just going to keep pushing." That night, Greg stayed on the property, keeping watch with a flashlight and a radio. Martha, exhausted but determined, sat by the fire, reviewing the old maps and deeds again. As she traced her grandfather's notations with her finger, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This land wasn't just hers, it was part of something bigger, something worth protecting. Around midnight, Greg called her on the radio. "We've got movement," he said. Martha grabbed her jacket and stepped outside, her heart pounding. In the distance, near the edge of the forest, she could see flashlights moving erratically. Greg had already called the sheriff, and within minutes, sirens pierced the quiet night. The intruders scattered as the police arrived, but one of them wasn't fast enough. When the deputies brought him to the cabin, Martha recognized him immediately. It was one of Eric's hired men, the same surveyor she had confronted weeks ago. As the man was taken into custody, Martha felt a surge of relief. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time she felt like she had the upper hand. Eric and Jenny might have started this fight, but Martha was determined to finish it. The land had waited for her to defend it, and she wasn't going to let it down. The arrest of one of Eric's men brought Martha a brief sense of vindication, but it wasn't long before the cracks in her fragile victory began to show. The sheriff's office, while sympathetic, warned her that the arrest alone might not be enough to stop Eric and Jenny. "We can hold him for trespassing," one of the deputies explained, "but unless we can tie him directly to the larger harassment campaign, there's not much else we can do." It wasn't the reassurance Martha had hoped for. Eric's name hadn't even come up in the man's initial statements, and without a direct link, it was all too easy for her cousins to deny involvement. The next morning, as she surveyed the damage to her property, the smashed cameras, the spray paint still marring her porch, Martha felt the weight of frustration pressing down on her. She called Evelyn to update her on the situation, hoping for some guidance. Evelyn, ever pragmatic, told her to stay the course. "This is a marathon, not a sprint," she said. "The more evidence we gather, the stronger our case becomes. But you need to stay vigilant. They know they're running out of options, and desperate people make reckless choices." That warning proved prophetic. 2 days later, as Martha was driving back to her cabin after a meeting with the local conservation group, she noticed a plume of smoke rising in the distance. Her stomach clenched as the realization hit her the smoke was coming from her property. She slammed on the gas, her truck bouncing over the uneven mountain road as she raced toward home. By the time she arrived, the fire had already engulfed the small barn near the edge of her property. The structure, which she had used to store old tools and leftover building supplies, was now a roaring inferno, the flames licking at the sky. Greg, her security guard, was already on the scene, frantically trying to control the fire with a garden hose. "I called the fire department," he shouted over the roar of the flames, "but it's spreading fast." Martha grabbed a second hose and joined him, the heat from the fire searing her skin as they worked to douse the surrounding area and prevent the flames from reaching the cabin. The fire department arrived just in time to stop the blaze from consuming the entire property, but the damage was devastating. The barn was reduced to a smoldering pile of ash, and several nearby trees had been charred beyond saving. As the firefighters packed up their equipment, one of them approached Martha with a grim expression. "This wasn't an accident," he said, holding up a small, blackened gas canister they had found near the barn. "This was arson." Martha's heart sank. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a wave of anger and fear crashing over her. She turned to Greg, who looked equally furious. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore," he said. "This is a direct message. They want to scare you into leaving." But fear wasn't the emotion dominating Martha's thoughts. It was rage. This was no longer just about protecting her land, it was about justice. Eric and Jenny had crossed a line, and she was determined to hold them accountable. She spent the rest of the night documenting the damage, taking photos of the burned barn and the gas canister before sending everything to Evelyn. "This changes everything," Evelyn said when Martha called her the next morning. "Arson is a felony. If we can connect this to Eric and Jenny, they'll be facing serious criminal charges." However, proving their involvement was easier said than done. Despite the mounting evidence of harassment, Eric and Jenny continued to deny any wrongdoing. When Martha confronted them directly during a chance encounter in town, Eric's response was as infuriating as it was predictable. "Fire? What fire?" he said with mock innocence. "Maybe you should take better care of your property, Martha. Sounds like negligence to me." Jenny, standing beside him, smirked but said nothing. Martha felt her fists clench at her sides, but she forced herself to walk away. Losing her temper wouldn't help her cause. Instead, she focused on strengthening her case. Evelyn had already filed for an emergency restraining order, and the conservation group she had been working with was beginning to draw attention to the ecological importance of her land. The discovery of the watershed area had sparked interest from local environmentalists, who were now rallying behind her. But Eric and Jenny weren't backing down. That weekend, while Martha was attending a conservation group meeting in town, Greg called her with urgent news. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "They're back. A whole crew this time, bulldozers, survey equipment, the works. They're clearing trees on the southern edge of your property." Martha's heart raced as Greg continued. "I've already called the sheriff, but you need to get here fast. They're acting like they own the place." When Martha arrived, the scene was worse than she had imagined. A line of heavy machinery was tearing through the forest, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Workers in hard hats moved with ruthless efficiency, ignoring Greg's attempts to stop them. Eric stood nearby, arms crossed and a smug grin plastered across his face. When he saw Martha, he raised a hand in mock greeting. "You're just in time," he called out. "Figured we'd save you the trouble of cleaning this place up." Fury boiled over as Martha marched toward him. "This is illegal," she shouted. "You have no right to be here." Eric's grin widened. "Actually, we do. Got all the paperwork right here." He held up a folder, waving it tauntingly. "Your little piece of paradise isn't as untouchable as you think. Turns out there's a clause in the zoning regulations that allows for land reclamation in the interest of public development. And guess who's funding the new access road? That's right, our friends at the development company." Martha's mind raced. She had heard Evelyn mention obscure zoning loopholes, but she hadn't thought they would move so quickly to exploit them. "This isn't over," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You can't just destroy my land and expect to get away with it." Eric shrugged. "We'll see, won't we?" The sheriff arrived shortly after, but even their intervention felt hollow. The workers had already cleared a significant portion of the forest, and Eric was quick to produce the paperwork he claimed authorized their actions. The sheriff, though skeptical, admitted that the matter would have to be settled in court. Until we can verify the validity of these documents, he said, there's not much else we can do. Martha felt the weight of defeat pressing down on her as she watched Eric and the workers pack up and leave, their destruction already done. But she wasn't ready to give up. That night, she called Evelyn and the conservation group, laying out everything that had happened. "They're trying to break you," Evelyn said, her voice steady but firm. "But you're stronger than this, Martha. They've made one crucial mistake. They've underestimated you. Let's make them regret it." As she hung up the phone, Martha felt a renewed sense of determination. Eric and Jenny might have pushed her to the brink, but they had also ignited a fire in her that couldn't be extinguished. This wasn't just a fight for her land anymore. It was a fight for justice, for her grandfather's legacy, and for every person who had ever been bullied by greed and entitlement. She didn't know how long the battle would last, but one thing was certain: she wasn't going to back down. Martha knew the time had come to make her stand. Eric and Jenny had pushed too far, and their latest act of destruction, the unauthorized clearing of her forest, left her with no choice but to escalate her response. With Evelyn's guidance, Martha filed an emergency injunction to halt any further development on the property. Simultaneously, the conservation group she had partnered with launched a public campaign to protect the land, citing its ecological significance. Articles began appearing in local news outlets, highlighting the illegal destruction of the forest and the potential environmental impact. While the growing attention provided a glimmer of hope, Martha understood that public opinion alone wouldn't be enough to stop Eric and Jenny. The tipping point came late one night. Greg was on patrol when he noticed movement near the edge of the property. Through the faint glow of his flashlight, he saw figures hauling equipment toward the creek that fed the watershed. One of them was Eric, directing the others as they worked quickly to erect a barricade meant to divert the water flow. Furious, Greg immediately radioed Martha, who called the sheriff. By the time law enforcement arrived, the intruders were gone, but the damage had been done. The barricade had disrupted the creek, leaving part of the watershed dry and vulnerable. Martha stood by the creek's edge, her fists clenched as the sheriff examined the scene. "This is deliberate sabotage," he said, shaking his head. "We'll open an investigation, but unless we catch them in the act, it's going to be hard to prove who's responsible." Frustration burned in Martha's chest. She was tired of watching Eric and Jenny act with impunity, confident they could bend the system to their will. That night, as she stared at the damaged creek, an idea began to take shape. If the law couldn't stop them fast enough, she would have to outmaneuver them herself. The next morning, Martha made a series of phone calls, pulling every string she could. She arranged for an environmental inspection of the property, enlisting experts from the conservation group to document the damage caused by the clearing and the barricade. At the same time, Evelyn worked to dig deeper into the development company that Eric and Jenny had partnered with. It wasn't long before they uncovered a crucial piece of evidence: financial records showing that Eric had received payments from the company just weeks before the harassment began. The money trail was damning, linking Eric directly to the developers and proving that his actions were far from innocent. Armed with this evidence, Evelyn filed a formal complaint with the state's Environmental Protection Agency, citing both the illegal destruction of protected land and the tampering with the watershed. The complaint triggered an immediate investigation, and within days, inspectors arrived on site. Eric and Jenny's attempts to deny responsibility were quickly undermined by the overwhelming evidence. Satellite images revealed the extent of the forest clearing, while water testing confirmed that the creek had been contaminated by chemicals left behind during the sabotage. But Eric and Jenny weren't finished. In a desperate bid to regain control, they resorted to their most brazen tactic yet. One evening, as Martha returned home from town, she found a group of workers on her property, attempting to erect a fence along what they claimed was a revised property line. Eric stood nearby, a smug expression on his face as he waved a stack of papers in the air. "This land isn't yours anymore," he declared. "We've had it reassessed, and the new boundaries put most of it under our control." Martha didn't even bother responding to his lies. Instead, she called Greg, who arrived minutes later with the sheriff. This time, however, the encounter didn't end with Eric walking away unscathed. The sheriff, armed with the evidence Martha and Evelyn had gathered, informed Eric that he was under investigation for fraud, vandalism, and environmental violations. As the workers hastily retreated, Eric's bravado faltered. "You think you've won," he sneered as the sheriff escorted him to his car. "This isn't over, Martha." But Martha could see the fear in his eyes. For the first time, Eric realized he wasn't untouchable. In the days that followed, the full scope of Eric and Jenny's scheme began to unravel. The state investigators uncovered more evidence of their collusion with the development company, including emails detailing their plans to force Martha off the land. Jenny, desperate to avoid legal consequences, turned on Eric and provided additional information to the authorities. Her testimony proved critical in exposing the extent of the corruption, including bribery of local officials to fast-track permits and silence complaints. The culmination of their downfall came during a court hearing, where Martha finally had the chance to confront them. Eric sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his once confident demeanor replaced by a sullen glare. Jenny avoided Martha's gaze entirely, her face pale as the judge reviewed the charges against them. Evelyn presented the evidence with precision, laying out a damning case that left no room for doubt. The court ruled in Martha's favor, issuing a permanent injunction to protect the property and ordering Eric and Jenny to pay substantial restitution for the damages they had caused. As the gavel came down, signaling the end of the hearing, Martha felt a wave of relief wash over her. The battle had been long and exhausting, but she had won. Eric and Jenny's greed and entitlement had been their undoing, and the land her grandfather had entrusted to her was safe at last. That evening, as she stood on the porch of her cabin, the sun setting over the restored forest, Martha allowed herself a moment of peace. The scars of the fight would take time to heal, but she knew she had honored her grandfather's legacy. The land, with its ancient trees and flowing creek, was hers to protect, and she would never let anyone take it from her again. The air was crisp and still as Martha walked through the forest, the morning sun casting dappled light on the ground. The property felt different now, as though it had exhaled after months of tension. The destruction caused by Eric and Jenny had left its scars, charred stumps where trees once stood, a barn reduced to rubble, but the land had begun to heal, much like Martha herself. The court's decision had been a resounding victory. Not only were Eric and Jenny barred from ever setting foot on her property again, but the restitution payments they were ordered to make would cover much of the damage they had caused. Their names were now synonymous with greed and disgrace, and the development company they'd partnered with was under investigation for corruption. Martha's steps carried her toward the creek, where workers from the conservation group were already at work restoring the watershed. They had dug up the remnants of the barricade Eric's men had built and were carefully re-establishing the natural flow of water. Martha smiled as she watched the team, their determination a reflection of her own. The group had officially declared the area a vital environmental resource, which meant the land would now be protected under state law. No future developer could touch it, no matter how deep their pockets or how underhanded their tactics. As she continued her walk, Toby darted ahead, barking playfully at the sound of rustling leaves. For the first time in months, Martha felt truly at ease. The fight had been grueling, but it had also reminded her of her own strength and resilience. She had stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated or silenced, and in the process she had uncovered just how much the land meant to her, not just as an inheritance, but as a living, breathing part of her family's history. Later that afternoon, she returned to the cabin to find a small package waiting for her on the porch. It was from Evelyn, who had taken it upon herself to gather the remnants of her grandfather's old maps and documents during the legal proceedings. Inside, Martha found a neatly arranged folder containing everything they'd uncovered about the property's history, along with a handwritten note. "Your grandfather would be proud," Evelyn had written. "You've proven that some legacies are worth fighting for." Martha set the package on her desk and opened one of the maps. Her grandfather's careful notations stood out, marking the locations of springs, old trails, and other hidden treasures on the land. She traced the lines with her finger, feeling a deep sense of connection to the man who had taught her to love this place. The land had always been more than property to him, and now she understood why. As the sun dipped low in the sky, Martha lit a fire in the cabin's hearth and settled into her favorite chair. Outside, the forest hummed with life, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves a comforting symphony. She picked up her journal and began to write, not about the battles she had fought, but about the future she envisioned for the land. The idea of turning it into a small ecological research center had taken root in her mind, and the conservation group had already expressed interest in partnering with her. The thought of sharing the land's beauty and importance with others gave her a renewed sense of purpose. The next morning, as she worked on repairing the front porch, a few of her neighbors stopped by to check on her. Though she had always valued her solitude, Martha found herself welcoming their company. They brought kind words and offers of help, expressing their admiration for her courage in standing up to Eric and Jenny. "You've inspired us all," one of them said. "This land is lucky to have you." That night, as Martha stood outside and looked out over the quiet expanse of her property, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The journey had been harder than she ever imagined, but it had also been worth it. She had proven to herself and to everyone else that some things are worth protecting, no matter the cost. The land was hers, as it always had been, and she would honor it for as long as she lived. As the first stars began to appear in the sky, Martha whispered a quiet promise to her grandfather's memory: "This land will always be safe. I'll make sure of it." With Toby by her side and the forest standing strong around her, she felt the weight of the past finally lift, replaced by a future filled with hope and purpose.